The hearing chamber smelled of recycled air and old dread. Captain Elias Wren sat behind the defendant's table with his wrists unbound, but his dress uniform stripped of every rank pin, the bare patches on his collar still showing the thread marks where stars had been ripped away that morning. Across from him, 7 admirals of the Terran naval judiciary sat in a crescent of polished oak and cold light, and behind them, through the viewport that ran the full width of the wall, the orbital docks of Caldera Station drifted past in silence, half their berths empty. Admiral Katrine Das opened the proceedings without ceremony. "Captain Wren, you are charged with dereliction of command, reckless expenditure of Terran naval assets, and unauthorized negotiation with a hostile foreign power. The loss stands at 41 warships of the line, 2,614 crew presumed dead. She let the number settle against the walls. How do you answer?" Wren looked at her. He looked at the row of faces behind her, faces he had served under, faces he had trusted, faces that had never once set foot in the Thessalan corridor. He could feel the weight of the stripped collar against his throat, the phantom heaviness of stars no longer there. "I answer," he said, "by telling you what happened." Das glanced at the tribunal recorder. The recorder nodded, fingers poised over a keypad older than the station. Das waved one hand, a gesture that meant speak. He began with the Dominion. The Vreth Dominion had held the Thessalan corridor for 1100 years. Not through military supremacy alone, though they possessed that in abundance. Through classification, through taxonomy, through a system so thorough that it had reduced 32 spacefaring species to numbers in a ledger. They called it the ledger of sanctioned existence. Every species in the corridor was assigned a value, a composite score derived from utility potential, threat quotient, reproductive index, and resource consumption. Species above a threshold of 0.5 were permitted to exist and govern their own affairs within Vreth parameters. Species between 0.25 and 0.5 existed at the Vreth sufferance, their shipyards capped, their populations monitored, their weapons restricted. Species below 0.25 were classified as unviable and scheduled for sterilization. The Vreth had sterilized 4 species in their 1100-year reign. The records were public. The Vreth considered them administrative achievements. Humanity was not in the ledger. That was the first problem. When the Terran exploration frigate Canticle had transited the Thessalan Gap 18 months prior, the Vreth border station had attempted to scan it, file it, and assign it a value. The scan returned no match. The Canticle's hull alloy did not correspond to any known material in the Vreth periodic archive. Its engine signature did not map to any propulsion taxonomy, not fusion, not antimatter, not fold drive, not any of the 9 recognized propulsion classes. The Vreth classification system simply returned null. Its crew, when hailed, spoke a language the Vreth translation grid could not parse for 9 full seconds, an eternity for a system that handled 32 species in real time. The border station had flagged the contact as anomalous pending classification and routed it to the Vreth Central Bureau of Species Assessment. The Bureau had opened a file. The file remained open for 4 months while the Bureau's taxonomist argued about which classification tree the new species belonged in. During those 4 months, 3 more Terran ships had transited the gap. Each one returned null on every scan. The Vreth did what the Vreth always did when confronted with something unclassified. They assembled a taxonomy fleet. Wren paused in his testimony and looked at the tribunal. "A taxonomy fleet," he said, "is what the Vreth send when they want to study something long enough to decide whether it should exist. It is not a diplomatic envoy. It is not an exploration force. It is an assessment engine with guns. 312 warships, escort cruisers with sensor arrays capable of reading hull alloy composition from half a light second away. Scan barges that could catalog the genome of every organism aboard a ship without breaching its hull. Kill platforms massive, slow, devastating, each one carrying enough directed energy weaponry to glass a continent in 11 minutes. And one Ledger Arbiter, a vessel the size of a small moon whose sole purpose was to process scan data and render a final classification verdict. The Arbiter was the Vreth's courthouse, their laboratory and their executioner, all in one hull. The taxonomy fleet arrived at the edge of Terran-claimed space on the 14th of March and transmitted a single message on all frequencies: submit to classification or be rendered unviable. Wren had been given 47 ships and told to hold the line. "I want the tribunal to understand," he said, leaning forward, his stripped collar catching the overhead light, "that I was not given 47 ships to win. I was given 47 ships to buy time while Earth decided whether the Vreth were worth negotiating with. My orders were explicit: do not engage unless fired upon. Do not provoke. Hold position. Wait." He let that sink in. I held for 6 hours. Then I stopped waiting. Admiral Das's expression did not change. Admiral Chen, third from the left, wrote something on his tablet. The other 5 admirals sat like carved stone. "Continue," Das said. The first engagement was not a battle. It was an examination. The Vreth taxonomy fleet spread into a scanning formation, a vast crescent of sensor-heavy cruisers projecting overlapping detection fields that covered a volume of space roughly the size of Earth's moon, and began methodically cataloging every Terran vessel in Wren's flotilla. Hull composition, engine output, weapons loadout, crew biosigns, shield harmonics, ammunition reserves. They measured the radioactive decay signature of the Ashfall's reactor core and compared it to known stellar fusion models. They found no match. They measured again. They were not attacking, they were filing. Wren let them scan. He sat in the command chair of the heavy cruiser Ashfall and watched the Vreth sensor beams wash across his hull like searchlights, and he used those 6 hours to do 2 things. The first was to study the Vreth fleet composition. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Ewan, mapped every ship in the formation and identified the species crewing each one. Of the 312 vessels, only 198 were crewed by Vreth. The remaining 114 were staffed by conscripted species: the Korath, the Peluri, the Osk, the Vrenkai, the Dotharan, and several other species, whose ledger values fell between 0.25 and 0.5, and whose military service was classified as a mandatory contribution to their viability score. They served the Vreth because the alternative was extinction. The second thing Wren did was something the Vreth did not expect, and the tribunal had not authorized. He opened a channel to the Korath. The Korath were one of the 32 species in the Vreth ledger. They had been assigned a utility value of 0.31, just above the viability threshold. For 11 centuries, they had existed at the Vreth sufferance, their shipyards capped at 12 construction berths, their population growth monitored by annual census drones, their military restricted to patrol corvettes with weapons rated no higher than Class 4. Their ships were fast but fragile, designed for border enforcement under Vreth supervision. They were, by the Vreth's own taxonomy, a species that existed only because the cost of exterminating them slightly exceeded the cost of tolerating them. Wren hailed them on an open frequency, not a secure channel, not a coded burst, an open frequency that every ship in both fleets could hear if they were listening. He said 4 words: "We don't have ledgers." The Korath did not respond for 14 hours. Wren waited. He did not hail again. Okonkwo asked him once during the wait whether he thought the Korath had reported his transmission to the Vreth. Wren said he didn't know. Okonkwo asked him what he would do if they had. Wren said he would deal with that when it happened. Okonkwo asked him how he could be so calm. He told her he wasn't calm. He was just out of better options. At the 15th hour, A single corvette broke formation from the Vreth escort screen and crossed the gap between the fleets. It was unarmed, its weapon mounts had been physically disconnected, the severed power cables trailing from the pylons like cut tendons. Its transponder was broadcasting defection, seeking TERMS. The corvette docked with the Ashfall, and a Koreth officer named Sethik Own walked aboard. He was tall, gray-skinned, with 4 articulated arms and eyes that shifted between amber and deep rust depending on his emotional state. When he stepped onto the Ashfall's deck, his eyes were rust-dark, the Koreth color of grief, though Ren would not learn that until later. He looked at Ren and said, "Tell me what you are offering." Ren told him. No ledger, no viability threshold, no species ranked by utility, no cap on shipyards, no census drones, no mandatory military service to justify the right to exist, an alliance, not a classification. The Koreth would fight alongside human ships as equals, and in exchange, when the Vreth ledger burned, every species beneath it would be free to build whatever they wanted, arm whatever they wanted, and exist without a number attached to their name. Sethik Own listened. His 4 arms were folded across his chest, 2 over 2, in what Ren would later learn was the Koreth posture of guarded assessment. He was quiet for a long time. Through the Ashfall's hull, they could both feel the faint vibration of the Vreth sensor beams still washing over the ship, still scanning, still filing. Then Sethik Own said, "You understand that you are asking us to die. I'm asking you to choose who you die for. We have 47 corvettes, Class 4 weapons, paper-thin hulls. Against kill platforms that can glass a continent. I know. And you have 47 warships against 312. I know that too." Sethik Own's eyes shifted to amber, the Koreth color of hard consideration. "Then you are either the bravest captain I have ever met or the most foolish." "I've been told both, usually by the same people." The Koreth officer unfolded 2 of his arms and placed one hand flat on the Ashfall's bulkhead, a gesture Ren did not understand until later, when he learned it was the Koreth equivalent of swearing an oath on sacred ground. "The Vreth will reclassify us as hostile the moment they detect our absence from the escort screen. Our homeworlds will be flagged for sterilization." Ren nodded. "That's why I need you to go back." Sethik Own stared at him. "Go back to your formation," Ren said. "Tell the other Koreth captains, tell the Peluri, tell the Osk, tell every species in that fleet that has a number below 1. Tell them what I told you, and when I give the signal, break." "What signal?" "You'll know it." Sethik Own held his gaze for 3 seconds, a long time by Koreth standards. Then he turned and walked back to his corvette. The docking clamps released. The small ship slid back into the gap between the fleets, crossed the dead space, and vanished into the Vreth escort screen. Ren watched it disappear. Then he stood at the viewport of the Ashfall's observation deck for 20 minutes, looking at the vast crescent of the taxonomy fleet, and he thought about what he had just done. He had staked his entire fleet, his career, and 2,000 human lives on the honor of a species he had met 40 minutes ago. He had no intelligence on Koreth culture, no diplomatic briefing, no psych profile, no precedent. He had looked at a man with 4 arms and rust-dark eyes, and a number that said his species was barely worth keeping alive, and he had seen something that wasn't in any file. He had seen someone who was tired of being numbered. The tribunal stirred. Admiral Chen leaned forward again. "Captain Ren, are you telling this panel that you initiated a covert alliance with an unvetted alien species, without authorization from Terran Command?" "Yes." "On what authority?" "On the authority of a man who was going to die in 6 hours if he didn't. You could have retreated. You could have requested reinforcements." "My orders were to hold, Admiral, and reinforcements would have taken 9 days to arrive. The Vreth sterilization timeline was measured in hours, not days. If I retreated, the Korath and every other conscripted species in that fleet would have had their homeworlds glassed before our reinforcements reached the corridor. Those were not your species to protect. Ren looked at Chen. With respect, Admiral, when someone asks you for help, their species stops being relevant. The chamber went quiet. Das gestured for him to continue. The Vreth completed their scan at hour 7. The Ledger Arbiter, that moon-sized classification engine, processed the accumulated data in a burst of computation that lit up the Ashfall's electromagnetic sensors like a second sun. Then it transmitted its verdict to every ship in both fleets simultaneously, on every frequency, in every language the translation grid could produce. The Vreth did not deliver verdicts quietly. They delivered them as proclamations. Ren still remembered the words. They had been projected onto the main screen of the Ashfall's bridge in cold blue text, automatically translated by the Terran linguistic AI. Species human, classification unlisted, threat quotient 009, utility value negligible. Reproductive index 0.44, suboptimal. Resource consumption high relative to output. Cultural archive none on record. Diplomatic potential not assessed, insufficient data. Verdict unviable. Recommendation immediate fleet level sterilization. Timeline within current engagement window. 0.09. Lower than any of the 32 species currently in the ledger. Lower than the 4 species the Vreth had already sterilized. The Vreth had looked at 47 Terran warships, ships carrying railguns that could accelerate a tungsten slug to 4% of light speed and pierce a planet's mantle at range. Ships with reactive hull plating that could repair blast damage in real time. Ships whose point defense networks could track and intercept 600 incoming projectiles simultaneously. Ships crewed by men and women who had crossed interstellar space in vessels their grandparents had designed, and they had assigned humanity a threat value lower than the Koraths. The classification was a death sentence wrapped in arithmetic. Ren had smiled when he read it, not a grim smile, not a battle smile, a real one, the kind that comes when the last piece of a plan you weren't sure would work falls into place. Okonkwo had looked at him from the tactical station with an expression halfway between disbelief and alarm. Captain, they just told 300 ships we're not worth worrying about. Yes, Ren said, that's the signal. That's the what? Think about it, Commander. Every Korath captain in that fleet just watched the Vreth assign humanity the same nothing the Vreth assigned them. Lower, actually. We're 0.09. The Korath are 0.31. As far as the ledger is concerned, we're worth less than the species the Vreth barely tolerate. Okonkwo's expression shifted. She understood. Ren opened a broadband channel every frequency. No encryption, maximum power, the kind of transmission that would reach every receiver in the engagement zone and could not be selectively jammed, and said 6 words to the Vreth fleet. Your ledger just made a mistake. For 11 seconds nothing happened. The Vreth formation held. The sensor beams continued their sweep. The kill platforms maintained their positions. On the Ashfall's bridge, Ewan counted the seconds aloud, each one heavier than the last. Then the Korath broke. Not 1 corvette, not 5. 47 Korath patrol ships, every single one in the Vreth escort screen, cut their formation locks simultaneously, pivoted on their axes, and lit their engines toward Ren's flotilla. Their transponders switched from Vreth fleet codes to an open civilian frequency, broadcasting a single word in Korath that the Ashfall's translator rendered as Unchained. Behind them, 11 Pellery frigates did the same. The Pellery broadcast no word. They simply cut their Vreth transponder feeds and turned their ships, and that silence was louder than any transmission. Then 9 Osk gunboats. Then 14 Vrenkai interceptors. Then a cascade of defections that spread through the Vreth formation like fractured lines through ice, ship after ship breaking away from the crescent. each one broadcasting its severance from the ledger, each one burning its classification number in a burst of open-channel static that was part navigation signal and part declaration of independence. In 90 seconds, 81 alien warships defected to Wren's fleet. The Vreth taxonomy fleet, which had been a crescent of 312 ships, was suddenly a crescent of 231, with 81 gaps in its formation, and 81 transponders now broadcasting on frequencies the Vreth could not control. Wren watched it happen from the Ashfalls Bridge. His hands were steady on the armrests, but his chest was tight. He had hoped for 20 defections. He had planned for 10. He had run the scenario in his head 100 times during those 14 hours of silence, and in his most optimistic projection, 30 ships switched sides. 81. Every single one of those ships was crewed by people who had just burned their classification, their safety, their viability score, their place in the only order they had ever known on the word of a human captain they had never met, relayed through a Korath officer who had spent 40 minutes aboard a human warship, and then gone back to his cage to whisper freedom to the other prisoners. The weight of that trust settled on Wren's shoulders like hull plating. He owed them a victory. He owed them everything. The Vreth responded the way the Vreth always responded to something that did not fit their taxonomy. They reclassified. The Ledger Arbiter broadcast an emergency update on all frequencies. All defecting species were retroactively downgraded to unviable. Their homeworlds were flagged for post-engagement sterilization. Their populations would be archived as extinct in the next Ledger revision. Effective immediately, any vessel broadcasting on non-Vreth frequencies was classified as a legitimate target regardless of prior species designation. The Vreth did not negotiate with unclassified entities. They filed them, and when the filing said unviable, they deleted them. The battle began at 14:07 station time. Wren split his combined fleet 128 ships, human and allied, into 3 tactical groups. He had 90 seconds to organize 81 alien warships he had never trained with, never drilled beside, never even spoken to until minutes ago, into a coherent fighting force. He did it with 3 transmissions. First group, all human warships in the Pellery frigates under his direct command aboard the Ashfall. 38 ships. They would drive straight at the Vreth Center and draw the kill platform's fire. Second group, a Conquo aboard the destroyer Kindling with 16 human destroyers and the 9 Osk gunboats and 14 Vrenkai interceptors. 39 ships. They would sweep wide and high to the flank, out of the Vreth formation's primary firing plane, and wait for the moment. Third group, all 47 Korath corvettes under Sethic Own. They would drop below the ecliptic plane and go dark. Sethic Own acknowledged with one word across the command channel, ready. The Vreth outnumbered them almost 2-1. Their kill platforms were heavy, slow, and devastating. Each one displaced more mass than Wren's entire first group combined, and their directed energy weapons could sustain a beam hot enough to melt through reactive hull plating at sustained range. Their scan barges provided real-time targeting data to the entire fleet through the Arbiter's Neuralink network. Their escort cruisers moved in geometric patterns that the Vreth had perfected over 11 centuries of enforcement actions formations that maximized overlapping fields of fire and minimized sensor, blind spots to mathematical zero. They had never fought an enemy they could not classify first. That was the weakness, not in their ships, not in their weapons, not in their numbers. In their need to know what something was before they decided how to kill it. Wren's center group hit the Vreth line at full burn. The Ashfall led, her 4 forward railguns firing in synchronized salvos that sent tungsten slugs across the gap at velocities the Vreth sensors could track, but the Vreth point defense could not intercept, because the Vreth point defense systems were calibrated for energy weapons and missile trajectories, not for solid projectiles moving at 4% of light speed. The slugs did not glow. They did not emit heat signatures. They were invisible until they hit. The first salvo punched through the lead kill platform's forward armor, 4 holes in a tight diamond pattern, each one the width of a cargo corridor, and detonated its forward munitions magazine from the inside. The explosion was visible across the entire engagement zone, a white flash that briefly outshone the local star and sent a shockwave of debris tumbling through the Vreth formation. 2 escort cruisers too close to the blast were shoved sideways, their geometric spacing ruined, their sensor arrays blinded by the electromagnetic pulse. 2 more kill platforms pivoted to engage Ren's center group. Their directed energy weapons carved lines of superheated plasma across the gap, and the frigate Harkin took a direct hit to her engine section. Ren watched the Harkin's drive signature flicker, stutter, and die on his tactical display. The ship drifted, venting atmosphere from a breach in her aft quarter. 94 crew. He filed the number away in the part of his mind that would write letters later and kept his eyes on the formation. He pushed forward. He split his group around the 2 kill platforms, letting the heavy ships pass through his line, a maneuver the Vreth had never seen, because no classified species had ever voluntarily let a kill platform get behind them. But Ren was not trying to survive the kill platforms. He was trying to get past them. While the 2 behemoths rotated their weapon arrays to track his ships, his lighter cruisers and the Pellery frigates raked their flanks with sustained railgun fire, each hit punching fist-sized holes through sensor blisters and communication relays. The Pellery were fast, faster than Ren had expected. Their frigates were designed for speed, and they used it, darting in close enough to target specific hull components, and then accelerating away before the Vreth's tracking systems could achieve a lock. One Pellery captain, Ren never learned the name, made 3 attack runs on the same kill platform in 90 seconds, each time hitting the same weapon port, until the port's power coupling blew and took the entire starboard weapon array with it. At the 6-minute mark, Ren lost the corvette's spite. She took 2 beam hits in rapid succession, the first stripping her reactive armor and the second cutting through her reactor shielding. The explosion was quick. Ren saw her name go dark on the display, said nothing, and adjusted the formation to close the gap she had left. At 7 minutes, the destroyer Cinder, caught between 2 escort cruisers in a crossfire that her point defense could not cover. Her captain, Commander Aikta, got off one last railgun salvo before the beams found his bridge. The salvo hit a scan barge's primary sensor array and destroyed it. The scan barge went blind. The Vreth's targeting was degrading. Their scan barges had been calibrated to track 47 human ships. Now there were 128 contacts on mixed frequencies, and 81 of them were broadcasting transponder codes that had been in the Vreth's own database 6 minutes ago. The Arbiter's Neuralink was trying to reclassify the defectors in real time, stripping their old species designations, and replacing them with unviable, target priority high, but the battlefield taxonomy took processing cycles. The ledger had been designed to classify species over months of careful assessment. It was not designed for a close-range battle, where allegiances changed in seconds and ships that had been allies 90 seconds ago were now firing into your formation. Kill platforms hesitated for fractions of a second before firing on ships that their systems still half-recognized as friendlies. Fractions of a second in a railgun fight meant the difference between a hit and a miss. Ren's fleet used every fraction. Okonkwo's flank group hit at the 12-minute mark. She brought the Kindling and her 38 ships in on a high-angle attack vector that put her above the Vreth formation above, in a spatial engagement where above meant perpendicular to the formation's primary firing plane. The Vreth had designed their warships for horizontal engagement. Their heaviest armor faced forward and to the sides. Their dorsal plating was the thinnest section on every hull, because in 11 centuries, no enemy had ever gotten above them. Okonkwo had calculated the angle during those 6 hours of scanning. She was very good at math, and she was better at killing things. Her destroyers fired down through the Vreth formation's dorsal aspect, railgun salvos punching through the thin top armor of 3 escort cruisers simultaneously. The Osk gunboats followed, their weapons smaller but their targeting precise. They hit engine manifolds, reactor vents, sensor clusters, the fragile infrastructure that kept a warship functioning. The Vrenkai interceptors, smallest and fastest of all, dove through the gaps between the Vreth ships at speeds the escort cruisers could not match, drawing fire away from the destroyers and forcing the Vreth to split their attention between threats above, below, and in front of them. The Vreth formation buckled. 3 escort cruisers broke away to engage Okonkwo's group, rotating their hulls to present their thicker lateral armor. The rotation took them out of their geometric pattern, and the pattern depended on every ship being in position. Other ships, trying to compensate for the gaps, collided with their own sensor coverage zones, creating blind spots that had not existed seconds before. The gap they left exposed the Ledger Arbiter's starboard flank, a section of that moon-sized hull that had not been directly threatened in 400 years of Vreth operations. Ren saw it, everyone on the Ashfalls bridge saw it. Ewan said quietly, "That's the spine." The Arbiter was more than a classification engine. It was the command nexus of the entire Vreth military. Every tactical update, every targeting solution, every formation adjustment, every reclassification order, everything flowed through that hull. The Vreth did not operate on independent initiative. They did not improvise. They operated on taxonomy, on classification, on the Ledger's constant stream of data telling them what everything was and how to respond to it. If the Arbiter fell, the Vreth would not just lose their command structure. They would lose their ability to classify the battlefield. And a Vreth that could not classify could not fight. Ren opened a channel to Sethic Own. One word now. The 47 Korath corvettes rose from below the ecliptic, like a school of predators, surfacing from a deep trench. They had been running dark for 18 minutes, no engines, no transponders, no active emissions of any kind, drifting on momentum alone with their crews breathing recycled air and watching passive sensors in the dark. The Vreth had not tracked them because the Vreth had already classified Korath corvettes as Class 4 threats, and Class 4 threats did not warrant continuous tracking during a fleet engagement. The Vreth's own classification system had told the Vreth fleet to ignore the Korath, to treat them as background noise, to dismiss them the way the Ledger dismissed everything that fell below the threshold. The classification system was wrong. During the 6 hours Ren had let the Vreth scan his fleet, Okonkwo had supervised a rapid refit in the Ashfalls engineering bays. Terran rail accelerator pods, compact, brutal, designed to bolt onto any hull with a compatible power bus and fire tungsten slugs at the same velocity as a heavy cruiser's main battery, had been welded to the Korath corvettes in pairs. Each corvette now carried 2 railguns rated at Class 9, the same weapons that the Ashfall herself carried. The Vreth had no classification for a Korath corvette armed with Class 9 weapons. Such a configuration did not exist in any Vreth database. It was not in the Ledger. It was, in the Vreth's own terminology, a category error, something that should not exist, could not exist, and therefore was not accounted for in any defensive model. 47 corvettes fired simultaneously at the Ledger Arbiter. 94 railgun slugs crossed the gap in 1.7 seconds. They were invisible, no engine glow, no heat trail, no electromagnetic signature, just metal moving at 4% of light speed. They struck the Arbiter's exposed starboard flank in a pattern that Okonkwo had calculated during those 6 hours of scanning, a targeting solution that concentrated all 94 impacts along the same structural seam, a joint between 2 primary hull plates that the Vreth had welded when the Arbiter was first constructed, 11 centuries ago. The Vreth had never reinforced that seam. Nothing in their taxonomy had ever warranted reinforcing it. No species in the ledger had ever fielded weapons capable of threatening the Arbiter's hull. No species in the ledger had ever gotten close enough to try. The seam was a maintenance joint, not a defensive vulnerability. It had been inspected once every 40 years and found adequate every time. 94 tungsten slugs hit it in the space of 1.7 seconds. The Arbiter cracked open. Not exploded, not detonated, cracked. The structural failure propagated along the seam like a fault line releasing centuries of stored tension, splitting the moon-sized hull into two asymmetric halves that drifted apart in a slow, terrible ballet. Atmosphere vented in white plumes that crystallized instantly in the vacuum, forming expanding clouds of ice crystals that caught the light of the distant star, and turned the space around the Arbiter into something that looked almost beautiful, if you did not think about what was inside those clouds. Power grids cascaded through failure states the Vreth engineers had never modeled, because you do not model the failure of something your taxonomy tells you cannot fail. Interior compartments open to space. The Arbiter's classification broadcast the constant, unbroken stream of ledger updates that every Vreth ship in the fleet depended on for targeting, formation maintenance, threat prioritization, and command authority cut to static mid-word. The Vreth fleet lost its mind. It happened in stages, and Wren watched each one from the Ashfall's bridge with the cold, focused attention of a man who had bet everything on this moment. First, the targeting. Every Vreth warship relied on the Arbiter's Neuralink for target prioritization. The link told each ship what to fire at, in what order with what weapons. Without the link, the targeting systems reverted to local processing software that had not been independently updated in decades, because the Arbiter had always been there, because the Arbiter had always told them what to do. The local systems could not handle the battlefield. There were too many contacts, too many mixed transponder codes, too many ships that the system still half-classified as friendlies firing at them from directions the formation geometry said were impossible. Ships that had been firing in coordinated volleys began shooting independently, each one picking its own targets based on degraded data. 3 escort cruisers fired on the same Pelori frigate simultaneously, overkilling a ship that one beam would have destroyed and leaving 3 other threats completely unengaged. Then the formations. The geometric patterns the Vreth had used for 11 centuries required constant micro-adjustments transmitted from the Arbiter's small corrections to each ship's position, heading, and velocity, dozens per second, keeping the pattern mathematically perfect. Without those adjustments, ships began to drift. The drift was small at first meters per second, but in a formation where ships were separated by precise distances, meters became collisions within minutes. An escort cruiser clipped a scan barge's sensor pylon. The pylon sheared off and tumbled into the path of a kill platform, which fired its point defense reflexively, destroying the pylon and showering 3 nearby ships with shrapnel. Then the panic. The Vreth were a species that had never operated without their taxonomy. They had never needed to improvise to assess a threat on instinct, to make split-second battlefield decisions without a classification framework telling them what everything was and how to respond to it. For 1100 years, the universe had been filed, categorized, numbered, and ranked. Every threat had a value. Every response had a protocol. The ledger told them what to fear and what to ignore, what to fight and what to absorb, and they had trusted it absolutely because it had never been wrong. Now the ledger was static. The universe was noise and fire and unclassified ships shooting at them from every direction. And the Vreth, for the first time in 11 centuries, had to think for themselves. They could not do it fast enough. Wren pushed his center group deeper into the disintegrating formation. He had lost the frigate Harkin, the corvette Spite, the destroyer Cinder, and the patrol ship Ember by now 4 ships, 4 crews, names that would join the letters he had not yet written. But the Vreth were dying faster. their coordination dissolving with every second the Arbiter's signal stayed silent. A kill platform, its targeting system locked in a classification loop that kept cycling between allied and unviable for every Koreth corvette in range, shut down its weapons entirely for 9 seconds. 9 seconds during which Sethek owns corvettes put 6 railgun rounds through its reactor shielding. The platform went dark. The defector ships fought with a fury that surprised even Ren, who had planned for it and hoped for it. The Osk gunboats, freed from 11 centuries of Class 4 weapons restrictions, formed into 3-ship hunting packs and targeted the Vreth scan barges one by one. The scan barges were the fleet's sensory organs. Destroy them, and the fleet could not see, could not classify, could not file. 7 scan barges died in 4 minutes. Each one took a piece of the Vreth understanding of the battlefield with it. The Pellery frigates screened for Okonkwo's destroyers, their speed making them almost impossible for the degraded Vreth targeting to track. One Pellery captain, running point ahead of the kindling, absorbed 3 beam hits intended for Okonkwo's ship. Her frigate's hull was slagged by the time the 3rd hit landed, but her crew evacuated to escape pods before the hull breach reached the crew compartments. Okonkwo's destroyers, shielded by that sacrifice, put a full broadside of railgun fire into a cluster of 4 escort cruisers and turned them into expanding clouds of wreckage. The Koreth corvettes were everywhere. They moved through the Vreth formation like wolves through a herd, their borrowed railguns giving them the firepower of ships 10 times their size. They fired at point-blank range close enough that even Class 4 weapons would have been effective, but the Class 9 railguns at that distance were annihilating. Engine ports, weapon arrays, sensor clusters, bridge sections. The Koreth targeted everything the Vreth needed to function, and destroyed it with a precision that spoke of 11 centuries of studying Vreth warship design from the inside, 11 centuries of serving on those ships, and knowing exactly where the weak points were. Sethek Own's voice came over the command channel at the 22-minute mark, flat and controlled. Captain Wren, the Koreth 3rd corvette has taken critical damage from a kill platform's secondary battery. Her reactor shielding is failing. Her crew is requesting permission to ram the nearest kill platform and use the reactor breach as a weapon. Denied, Wren said immediately. A pause, Captain. In Koreth military tradition, a crew that has lost its ship is alive and valuable and is going to stay that way. Get her crew off. Transfer them to any ship with space. The crew has expressed. I heard what the crew expressed, Sethek. My answer is no. Those 18 people are not a weapon. They are allies. Get them off that ship. Another pause, longer this time. Then, understood, Captain. The Koreth 3rd corvette was evacuated in 4 minutes. Her crew, 18 Koreth sailors who had expected to die and were now confused about why a human captain had refused to let them, were distributed among 3 nearby corvettes. The empty ship drifted into the debris field around the Arbiter's wreckage, her hull dark, her railgun pods still warm. At the 26-minute mark, the Vreth flagship, the dreadnought Absolute Taxonomy, largest combat vessel in the Vreth fleet after the Arbiter attempted to restore fleet coordination by broadcasting its own targeting data on the Arbiter's old frequency. For 90 seconds, the Vreth formation began to reconsolidate around the dreadnought's signal. Ships found their positions again. Firing patterns resumed something approaching their old geometric precision. Wren saw it happening on his tactical display. He saw the formation tightening, the gaps closing, the Vreth's 11 centuries of ingrained discipline overriding the panic as the Absolute Taxonomy gave them something to file themselves against. He transmitted 2 words to Sethek Own, the flagship. 12 Koreth corvettes converged on the Absolute Taxonomy from 3 angles. The dreadnought's point defense was formidable. It destroyed 4 corvettes in rapid succession, their hulls coming apart under beam fire that would have vaporized any ship in the engagement zone. 4 more ships, 4 more crews. Wren felt each loss like a physical blow. but the other 8 corvettes got close enough. 16 railgun slugs hit the Absolute Taxonomy's communication array at nearly the same instant. The array, a massive, delicate structure designed to broadcast fleet-wide coordination data, disintegrated. The Vreth dreadnought went silent. Its weapons still fired, its engines still burned, but it could no longer speak to its fleet, and without speech, it was just another ship. A very large, very angry ship that could not tell anyone what to do. The Vreth formation came apart for the second time. This time, it did not come back. At the 31-minute mark, the Vreth began to surrender, not in groups, individually, one ship at a time, each one broadcasting its own classification code as a white flag because that was the only form of submission the Vreth understood. They did not know how to say, "I quit." They did not have a word for it. They only knew how to file themselves as defeated to assign themselves a new classification, combat ineffective, requesting cessation. Wren accepted each surrender. He assigned human and allied ships to escort the surrendering vessels to a designated holding area, and he gave explicit orders that no surrendering ship was to be fired upon, even if its classification broadcast was incomplete, even if its weapons were still hot. Okonkwo pointed out that 4 of the surrendering ships still had their weapons armed and could be feigning. "Accept the surrender," Wren said. "We're not the Vreth, we don't have a threshold." By the 44-minute mark, it was over. 168 Vreth warships had been destroyed or disabled. 63 had surrendered. The Ledger Arbiter was a drifting ruin, its 2 halves still turning slowly in the starlight, its classification archives dark for the first time in 1100 years. The Absolute Taxonomy drifted without communications, its captain broadcasting surrender on a local frequency. The Thessalan corridor, which had been controlled space for 50 generations of Vreth governance, was uncontrolled. Wren's combined fleet had lost 41 ships, 32 human, 9 allied, 2,614 crew, the number Admiral Das had read at the start of the hearing, the number that would follow Wren for the rest of his life, the number he would never, not once, allow himself to round down. He stopped speaking. The hearing chamber was very quiet. Through the viewport behind the admirals, a Koreth corvette still carrying its bolted-on railgun pods, the welds still visible where Okonkwo's engineers had attached them, drifted past on a patrol vector, its transponder broadcasting on Terran Alliance frequencies. It was one of Sethik-owned ships. Wren recognized the hull markings. Admiral Das watched the corvette pass. Then she looked back at Wren. "You lost 41 ships, Captain." "I did." "You armed alien vessels with Terran weapons systems, without authorization from Terran Ordnance Command." "I did." "You negotiated an alliance with 7 alien species, the Korath, the Peluri, the Osk, the Vrenkai, the Dotharan, the Sulan, and the Ikari, none of which had been vetted by Terran intelligence, none of which had existing diplomatic relations with Earth, none of which had been assessed for strategic reliability." "I did." "You attacked a fleet that outnumbered you more than 2 to 1, in a corridor that Terran Command had designated as a holding zone, not an engagement zone, in direct contravention of your orders." "Yes." "You refused a Koreth officer's request to allow a traditional combat death for his crew, overriding an allied species' cultural practice during active combat operations." "Yes, I don't accept traditions that require good people to die when they don't have to. Not human traditions, not Korath traditions, not anyone's." Das removed her reading glasses and set them on the table. She folded her hands. The gesture was deliberate, and every officer in the chamber recognized it, the shift from examination to summation. The recorder's fingers went still. "And in doing so, Captain Wren, you liberated 32 species from a classification system that had determined the right to exist for 1100 years and would have eventually reached Earth. You broke the only fleet capable of enforcing it. You destroyed the only classification engine capable of processing its data. You established the first multi-species military alliance in Terran naval history. And you did all of this in 44 minutes. Wren said nothing. There was nothing to say to a summation that was also, in its precise, judicial way, a commendation. The Korath ambassador has been in contact with this tribunal, Das continued, her voice unchanged in speed or pitch. He arrived at Caldera Station 3 days ago and has met with each member of this panel individually. He has stated that 7 species, the Korath, the Peluri, the Osk, the Vrenkai, the Dotharan, the Sulin, and the Ikari have formally requested permanent military alliance with the Terran fleet. He has stated that this request is made specifically because of your conduct during the engagement, not your tactics, not your weapons technology, not your fleet's combat performance, your conduct. She let the word hang. He has stated that the word his people use for what you did does not translate directly into any Terran language. The closest approximation, he says, is the one who broke the number. He explained that in Korath culture, a number assigned by a higher authority is considered inviolable sacred, even. It cannot be questioned, contested, or denied. To break a number, to refuse to accept a classification imposed from above, is simultaneously the highest form of rebellion and the deepest form of respect. It means you looked at someone who had been told they were worth 0.31, and you said that number was a lie. She paused again. Through the viewport, the Korath corvette completed its patrol arc and turned, its railgun pods catching the light. He also told us, Das said, that when Sethic Own reported your refusal to let the 3rd Corvette's crew die, every Korath captain in the fleet stopped their ships for 11 seconds. In Korath tradition, that is the mourning period for someone who has passed, but they were not mourning. Sethic Own explained that the pause was for something else. He said the word translates roughly as the moment you realize the universe is larger than you thought it was. She looked at the other 6 admirals. Each one met her eyes. Something passed between them that did not need words. She looked at the recorder. The recorder nodded and positioned her hands. She looked at Wren. This tribunal is prepared to render its verdict. Wren sat still. He had not slept in 4 days. He had written 41 letters to the families of the dead handwritten. Everyone, on paper, he had requisitioned from the Ashfall supply stores, because a printed letter was not enough and a digital message was an insult. Each letter had said the same thing in different words. Your person died because I made a choice, and the choice was mine, and I would make it again, and I am sorry, and sorry is not enough, and nothing ever will be. He had stood on the Ashfall's observation deck at 300 station time, and watched the Arbiter's wreckage drift through the Thessalan corridor, its 2 halves turning slowly in the starlight like the covers of a book that had been torn apart at the spine. A broken monument to an empire that had believed, with absolute mathematical certainty, that everything in the universe could be assigned a value, every species, every ship, every life, every possibility, and that had encountered one species that refused to accept one. Captain Elias Wren, Das said, this tribunal finds you guilty of every charge as stated. The chamber inhaled. Behind Wren in the gallery, someone made a sound half gasp, half curse, bitten off before it could become a word. The recorder's fingers stopped mid-keystroke. Admiral Chen's face did not change, but his hand tightened on the edge of his tablet. The tribunal further finds, Das continued without pause, without change in her voice's pitch or speed, that every action taken was necessary, proportionate, and conducted in accordance with the highest traditions of the Terran Navy. Your rank is restored effective immediately. Your command is restored. The 41 lost vessels will be replaced from the Caldera Reserve Fleet, and the allied species who fought beside you will be offered permanent berths at Terran orbital facilities. The chamber exhaled. The tribunal also notes, Das said, and now there was something in her voice, not warmth, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that a woman who had spent 40 years in naval law might feel when the law and justice happened to arrive at the same place. That the Vreth Central Bureau of Species Assessment has formally requested a meeting with Terran diplomatic representatives. They wish to discuss reclassification. She paused. A ghost of something crossed her face, not a smile, more like the memory of having once known how to produce one. Apparently, their ledger now has a new entry for humanity. The threat quotient has been revised from 0.09 to a value the Bureau describes as beyond scalar measurement. The Bureau's chief taxonomist has stated, for the official record, that this is the first time in 1100 years that the Vreth ledger of sanctioned existence has failed to produce a number for any entity. Wren nodded once. One more thing, Das said. The tribunal has reviewed the broadband transmission you sent to the Vreth fleet at the moment of the defection, the 6-word transmission. Your ledger just made a mistake. We have a question. Wren waited. Was it a mistake? He looked at her. He looked past her, at the viewport, where the Koreth corvette was completing its second patrol arc, its human-built railguns catching the amber light of the station's guide lamps. He thought of Sethik Own walking aboard the Ashfall with nothing but a sidearm and a number that said his species was barely worth keeping alive, and then walking back to the Vreth formation to whisper freedom to every caged species in that fleet. He thought of the 81 ships that had broken formation on the word of a man none of them had met. He thought of the Koreth 3rd Corvette's crew, 18 sailors who were alive, because he had told them that dying for tradition was not the same as dying for something that mattered. He thought of the 4 words he had transmitted on an open frequency to a species he knew nothing about except the most important thing, that they were tired of being told what they were worth. We don't have ledgers. No, Wren said. It wasn't a mistake. They classified us exactly as we wanted them to. The tribunal stared at him. 0.09, he said quietly, and his voice carried in the silent chamber the way it had carried across the gap between 2 fleets. That was the number that made every Koreth captain, every Pelori helmsman, every Osk gunner in that fleet look at the humans and think, the Vreth gave them the same nothing they gave us. Lower, actually. The Vreth looked at a species that crossed interstellar space, built railguns, and crewed 47 warships, and they said, these creatures are worth less than the species we barely tolerate. He paused. That number didn't underestimate humanity, Admiral. It told 32 species that we understood what it felt like to be worth nothing to the Vreth, to be filed and numbered, and told that your existence was conditional on a score you didn't choose and couldn't change. That 0.09 was the most honest thing the Vreth ever put in their ledger, because it showed every conscripted species in that fleet that the Vreth system wasn't about accuracy. It was about control. And any system that assigns a 0.09 to humanity is a system that would eventually assign a 0 to everyone. He straightened in his chair. So no, Admiral, the ledger didn't make a mistake. It worked exactly as designed, and that was worth more than 47 warships. Because that number, that 0.09, bought me 81 ships crewed by people who had spent 11 centuries waiting for someone to tell them that numbers don't decide who gets to exist. Das held his gaze for a long time. The other 6 admirals were motionless. The recorder had resumed typing, but slowly, as though the words needed to be placed with care. You are dismissed, Captain, Das said. Your fleet is waiting. Wren stood. He straightened his uniform, the one with the bare patches where his rank stars had been. Someone would replace them within the hour. A yeoman was probably already opening the box, selecting the pins, preparing the collar. He walked to the door of the hearing chamber, and as he opened it, he could see the corridor beyond. Okonkwo leaning against the far wall with her arms crossed, her destroyer captain's insignia freshly polished, and Sethik Own standing beside her tall, gray-skinned, his 4 arms folded in the Koreth resting posture, his dress uniform bearing no rank insignia, because his species had never been permitted rank under the Vreth ledger. Okonkwo straightened when she saw him. "Well, guilty on all counts," Ren said. "Full restoration." Sethik On's head tilted slightly to the left, the Korath expression for amusement. "Your tribunal found you guilty, and then returned your command." "That's how humans do it," Okonkwo said. "We punish the ones we're proud of." Sethik On considered this for a moment. Then he reached out with his upper right hand and placed it on Ren's shoulder, the same hand he had placed flat on the Ashfall's bulkhead when he first swore his oath. In Korath tradition, a warrior who is punished and honored in the same breath is called unbreakable. It is the highest rank we possess. Under the ledger, we were never permitted to award it. He withdrew his hand. "Consider it awarded." Ren nodded. Something loosened in his chest, not the grief, not the weight of the names, but something else, something that had been clenched since the first railgun salvo and had not released until this moment. Standing in a corridor with his first officer and an alien who had staked his entire species' existence on Ren's word. The three of them walked together toward the docking ring, toward the Ashfall and the fleet that waited beyond the station's hull, a fleet larger than the one Ren had left with, larger by 81 ships crewed by 7 species who had chosen to fight beside humans, not because they were ordered to, not because a ledger assigned them, not because a taxonomy compelled them, but because one captain had opened a channel across the gap between two fleets and said the only thing that mattered. Behind them, through the station's exterior hull, the Thessalan corridor stretched into deep space, empty now of the Vreth scanning formations, empty of the ledger's cold arithmetic, empty of the 1100-year silence that had kept 32 species quiet and filed and numbered and afraid. The corridor was open, and at its far end, the Korath homeworld was building its first warship without a classification number. It would carry railguns. Terran specification, Class 9, bolted into a hull that the Korath were designing themselves for the first time in 11 centuries, a hull without Vreth specifications, without mandated limitations, without a classification stamp telling the galaxy what the ship was rated to do. Sethik On had requested the railgun specifically. When asked why, he had said something that the Ashfall's translators rendered as, "Because the captain of the Ashfall taught us that the weapon matters less than who you choose to stand beside, but the weapon still matters." Ren had laughed at that. It was the first time he had laughed since the battle, and it had surprised him, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than the 41 letters, deeper than the 2,614 names, deeper than the bare patches on his collar that would soon hold stars again. It came from the same place as the 4 words he had transmitted to the Korath on an open frequency, when he had looked at a species valued at 0.31 and seen something the Vreth ledger could never classify. Allies. The Ashfall's engines lit. The fleet formed up around her human destroyers and heavy cruisers, Korath corvettes with their bolted-on railguns gleaming in the station light, Pellery frigates running swift at the flanks, Osk gunboats holding the rear in tight 3-ship packs, Vrenkai interceptors darting between the capital ships in flight patterns. The Vreth had never permitted them to fly a formation that no ledger had a taxonomy for, moving in a pattern that no archive could predict. Crewed by species that had been told for 11 centuries exactly what they were worth. They were worth more now. The fleet entered the corridor, and the dark closed behind it, and somewhere in the wreckage of the Arbiter, the last entry in the Vreth ledger of sanctioned existence flickered on a dying screen. Species human. Classification, error value exceeds all known parameters. Threat quotient, unresolvable. Recommendation, field blank, no precedent EXISDS. The screen went dark, the ledger was done. And in the corridor ahead, the fleet that had no number moved on, carrying rail fire and alliance and the quiet, unbreakable certainty that some things could not be filed.